Hitachi Energy is proud to partner with the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. Powering Purpose is a new book resulting from the partnership between Hitachi Energy and Monocle. It tells the story of the people and the technology leading the energy transition and ushering in a sustainable and secure future. Hitachi Energy and Monocle work together to provide inspiration on powering people's lives and where to find the energy for change in the era of electrification. Secure your copy now at monocle.com or in store in Monocle outlets around the world. And if you want to understand the role you can play in harnessing connections to ensure a brighter, more sustainable and secure future, head to hitachienergy.com. Hitachi Energy and Monocle, inspiring the energy for change.
A little over a year ago, President Bashar al-Assad of Syria probably thought things were motoring along okay. He remained in charge of his country despite a decade and a half of conflict he had done much to start and little to stop, but as history tends to get written by the victors, no real worries there. The Arab League had welcomed him back. The incoming president of the United States didn't seem much concerned with him. To the extent that anyone had won Syria's long and ghastly civil war, Assad could reasonably claim that it was him. A little over a year ago, Ahmed al-Sharaa, also known and feared by the nom de guerre Abu Muhammad al-Julani, was the emir of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an Islamist militia based in Idlib province in Syria's northwest. He was also a wanted man. The United States had offered $10 million for information leading to his apprehension, that he might be charged with crimes committed during his memberships of al-Qaeda and al-Nusra. Lenin, who knew something about the transformation from exiled rebel to national leader, is frequently credited with a remark to the effect that there are decades when nothing happens and weeks when decades happen. As is very often the case with viral online aphorisms, there is no evidence that the person to whom it is attributed ever said or wrote any such thing, but whoever did coin it wasn't wrong. Exactly 1 year ago, Syria was having one of those weeks. As a consequence of which, Bashar al-Assad is now languishing in nervous exile in Moscow, and Ahmed al-Sharaa is president of Syria, and now wanted by the United States only as a guest in the White House, where he was received by President Donald Trump in November. On the first anniversary of Syria's revolution, what progress is the country making? Is Ahmed al-Sharaa now a president or still a warlord? And what do the neighbours think? This is the Foreign Desk.
We didn't think this would happen. Those of us who were on the opposition enemy list of the regime never thought we would be back.
He still has a lot of work to do in terms of getting Syrians and the jihadists whose shoulders he rode into Damascus on behind him.
The extent and scale of the devastation in Syria means that Syria cannot do this alone. So international collaboration, foreign direct investment, and other types of incentives are necessary.
You're listening to the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. I'm joined first of all by the correspondent and documentary maker Martin Smith, recently producer of the PBS frontline film Syria After Assad, and who was, back in 2021, the first Western journalist to interview the then Abu Muhammad al-Julani, now President Ahmed al-Sharaa. Martin, if we think back to a year or so ago, I think the general response to the fact and the speed of Assad's fall was one of bewilderment. Was it like that to someone such as yourself, who'd had recent experience of Syria? Were you as surprised as everyone else?
I was totally surprised. I had been there in 2021 to interview him 4 years before the fact of his successful deposing of the dictator in December 24. And I asked him very little about his future plans. I didn't really think that it was in the cards, and if he'd told me that they were going to take Damascus, I would have raised an eyebrow.
So you didn't leave that encounter with the then Abu Muhammad al-Julani thinking you'd just met the future president of Syria?
Not at all, not at all. It's interesting because we put together a follow-up program to the one that we produced in 21. And in that, we found some footage of him addressing some troops in which he said all that has to happen is for Russia, Hezbollah to pull out and Iran and not support Assad, and he would be gone in a matter of a week. Well, that's what happened.
I mean, leaving that aside and leaving aside the great surprise he sprang on the world a year ago, what was your overall impression of him? Because, at the time, obviously, he was regarded by the United States and most of the Western world as an absolute rogue at best. There was a serious bounty on his head. Did he come across as the terrorist kingpin he was depicted as to you?
No, he came across as a very sophisticated, savvy individual who was quite open. It was easy to talk to him. I did not find him to be in any way threatening. I do think that perhaps he wasn't thrilled with the treatment we gave him in that program, because we did talk to people who had relatives who were tortured in his prisons. And, he had denied all that was true. So I had some questions about him, and I talked to him about the use of suicide bombs and whatnot. He was trying very hard to reestablish himself. But he comes from a middle-class family in Damascus and from the Golan Heights. That's actually the origin of his name, al-Jilani. So he wasn't a crude character by any means.
I mean, did you get the sense, though, that even if his plans were not clear, perhaps even not to him at that point, his thinking was evolving? Because his associations with al-Qaeda are a matter of record. He was a hardcore jihadist at one point, if anybody was. But did he seem to be coming around the way of thinking that that was not necessarily the future?
Well, he thought that fighting in Iraq was something that was a noble cause, and that many people from around the Middle East had gone to Iraq. And the group you joined, in most cases, was al-Qaeda in Iraq. I should point out that he also received a lot of money from ISIS. So not only was he al-Qaeda, he was ISIS. So he was, on paper, he was a pretty bad dude. But I don't think that, was he evolving at the time that I saw him? He was certainly trying, and had been for a couple of years, I believe, to break off from al-Qaeda, to certainly break off from ISIS. And he saw that, his goal was always to topple Assad. And he saw that to do that, he was going to need friends outside the country. And that's what he's trying to do now. He's trying to gather European and American help for his project.
Well, given that background, though, and again, I guess framing this through your meeting with him a few years back, are you entirely buying the transformation he's trying to sell, that he does now wish to be seen as this relatively moderate, extremely pluralistic, if not quite full-fledged Democrat, than with ambitions in that direction?
Well, you have to keep in mind that he spent about 4 or 5 years in U.S. prisons, including Abu Ghraib and others. And during that time, he spoke to me about how he was uncomfortable with what he saw as the tactics of al-Qaeda and ISIS in Iraq. And so even then, he was expressing some concerns. And, I said, well, why didn't you leave? And he said, well, we talked about that. And he did, essentially, by going to Syria and setting up his chapter. He needed help, so he took support from ISIS first and from al-Qaeda. But his goal was to topple Assad. That was his sole mission.
So what did you find, broadly speaking, when you returned to make your film Syria After Assad? What was the response of, I realise there's not a single monolithic Syrian opinion any more than there is from anywhere else, but Syrians must have been more bewildered than anybody else by the scale and the speed of what had happened.
Well, they were thrilled that the war was over. So there was some consensus on that. But all across the country, what we found is that there was still resistance. There was resistance in the south from certain Druze groups that didn't trust somebody who was a former terrorist, if you will. And the killings along the coast in March of Alawites revealed that al-Sharaa didn't control all the men that were under his government. He didn't have control over many of the militias that took part in those killings of Alawites along the coast. And then in the northeast, he still has a huge problem, I think perhaps his biggest one, and I think it receives less attention than others, and that is with the Kurdish leadership there, who's been distrustful of him. They've fought him, they've died fighting him, and he needs them more than anybody else because they have the oil, the gas, the water, and it's the most fertile part of the country in terms of growing food.
I mean, does that strike you as a bridge, or rather an entire radius of bridges that al-Sharaa is going to be able to cross? Because there have been a lot of reports, and you made some of those reports yourself, about the fear of minorities in Syria, including the Alawites, which was the sect to which the Assad family belonged, that they won't be protected, that there will be no place for them in Syria led by somebody like al-Sharaa.
Well, he has to try. I mean, the easy part of his project was getting to Damascus. The hard part is governing. And that's the case with anybody who's taken on a job of that nature. In Syria, it's especially difficult for the history of violence and sectarian and ethnic hatreds that abound in that country. So do I think it's possible that he can manage this situation? Yeah, I think it's possible. But it's going to take some time. I mean, they have recently had some violence breaking out in homes between Alawites and Sunnis, and it hasn't spread. It didn't, spin out of control. He is making agreements with the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Force up in the north. His problem with Israel remains. Israel has been taking advantage of instability in Syria ever since al-Sharaa got to Damascus in December.
Well, just finally then, and again, this is another spectacle that I think few would have imagined 12 months before it occurred. We did recently see President al-Sharaa welcomed to the White House by the President of the United States. What have you made of the United States' eagerness to embrace him? Is that going to be more of a help to him than a hindrance? And I guess perhaps, given his record, is this something that perhaps could come back to bite the US one day?
His problem all along here has been that many of the people whose shoulders he rode on to get to Damascus are not westernized. They don't have a liberal view of Syria's future. And those people, many of them are hardcore jihadists. And those people are, of course, going to be scratching their heads when they see him in the White House. On the other hand, they're very proud that their guy is managing to get an audience in Washington. It is confounding. And then just a few days later, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia arrives in the White House to rehabilitate his image in the West. So Trump is very transactional and open to whatever he can get. He's not ideologically based, I don't believe. But can al-Sharaa succeed? He arrived in Damascus with only his foreign minister, Shebani, in tow. And he had to put together a government from scratch. And he made some mistakes early on. He had people in his government that had been videotaped killing women for allegedly having committed adultery. So he had these kind of people in his government, and he still has a lot of work to do in terms of getting Syrians and the jihadists whose shoulders he rode into Damascus on behind him.
That was Martin Smith, correspondent and producer for Frontline on PBS. Syria After Assad is available now. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Joining us now is Reem Alaf, Syrian-born writer and political analyst and author of It Started in Damascus, How the Long Syrian Revolution Reshaped Our World. Reem, I'll start by asking about an image you posted on social media quite recently. If I'd asked you about a year ago what you thought the chances were that a year from then you'd be strolling through the old city of Damascus with a copy of your new book under one arm, what would you have regarded as the chances of that?
Close to zero, I would say. A year ago, even when 1 year ago, at the end of November, on the 27th of November, in fact, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, under the leadership of Ahmed al-Sharaa, who was then called Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, his nom de guerre, began their offensive on regime forces in Aleppo. Nobody imagined that they would be that successful. I think we all expected skirmishes to last, for battles to increase, for the Russian Air Force to lend once again its support, and for Iran to bring in the heavy support that Assad would have needed to remain. So I think that we were all taken by surprise when a few days later it became clear that it was not just Aleppo that was being taken by the rebels, by the opposition to Assad, but one by one we all watched the cities as they came. They basically crumbled. The forces of the Assad regime just stopped fighting for the regime. They understood this was a losing battle by now. So 14 years later, finally, Syrians were rid of the regime that had been making their lives a misery for nearly 55 years. It was 54 years of Assad regime. We didn't think this would happen. Those of us who were on the opposition enemy list of the regime never thought we would be back. It was a surreal feeling. On the day of the release of my book on November 6th, I held a copy of my book between the Jupiter Roman temple and the Umayyad Mosque, which is the cover of my book. And I held it up because this was in the realm of the impossible for me, and everything changed.
As we speak, you are just back from Syria a few days ago, and obviously it is now a year since those events, a year in which Syrians have, I guess, got past the initial stages of jubilation and or confusion and started to understand what their new reality is going to be like. So a year on, how optimistic would you say you are about how things are tracking?
If you look at the very immediate picture, there's very little to be extremely happy about. We are all still relieved. I believe the vast majority of the Syrian population is relieved that the Assad regime has gone, and there will be undoubtedly huge celebrations to mark the event on the 8th of December. But daily life is very difficult. So first of all, on a personal level, people are feeling the brunt of the crisis that took 15 years to culminate in this point. Inflation is crazy, really. And $1 buys you about 12,000 Syrian pounds compared to 50 pounds before the beginning of the war. People are struggling to put food on the table. People do not have access to electricity. I can tell you from personal experience, I stayed in our home in Damascus. The electricity would come in the good areas where we are for about 2 hours, then would remain cut for 4 to 5 hours. But the biggest problem is the lack of water. Water comes once every 3 days for the vast majority of Syrians. The United Nations tells us some 90% of Syrians are in dire need right now, is an impossibility. So the miseries of daily life are very clear for everybody to see. There's a lack of cash, a lack of jobs, a lack of reassurance that things are going to change.
Do you get a sense, though, that is being at all hindered by perhaps a sort of collective trauma still, not just from 15 years of horrendous war, but from the fact that most Syrians until a year ago would have had absolutely no recollection of being ruled by anybody not called Assad? Has that been a hard thing for Syrians to adjust to?
100%. And I believe that they have not really come to terms with that yet, let alone the trauma that people who endured the brunt of the war that the Assads and that the Russians and that the Iranians unleashed on them all these years, all the millions of people who remain refugees or IDPs around big areas of Syria. So even that particular trauma, we need years, maybe decades to deal with. But on an individual level, Syrians are still trying to really comprehend the parallel universe. They have shifted timelines, if you wish. As you mentioned, the Assads were in power. Hafiz Assad took power in 1970, but the Ba'ath Party had been in power since 1963. So the overwhelming majority of Syrians has never known anything but that. And I think it is an excellent point you bring, which is a segue to also the security issues and the issues of mistrust between different Syrian entities, let's call them that, different geographical areas and different ethnic areas. They have been raised on this cancer that was Assadization, and Assadization of society, of state institutions, of the army that worked for 55 years to defend a regime and not a country. These are all a product of this attempted indoctrination, and they've known nothing else. The one thing that they have learned over the past 14, 15 years is that they have the right, or they have themselves given themselves the right to freedom of speech. They are very vocal in their protests, in their disagreements with the new authorities, with the new regime. And this is leading us to a very loud, big room where everybody is shouting and everybody is demanding something from the other. And this picture, when you look at Syria immediately, if you were to take a very quick photo, you would see this is an impossible country to govern. They cannot live together. But I do believe the opposite is true.
There's another constituency of Syrians that didn't really exist in the way it does 15 years ago, which is, of course, the Syrian diaspora, the millions of Syrians who have fled the country over the last 15 years. Does that diaspora community strike you as something that might be able to play a role in rebuilding Syria, whether it's because they come back with money and expertise and new ways of thinking about things, or whether they contribute from where they are now? Because that is a whole new factor that no previous government of Syria has had to deal with, at least not at this scale.
I believe it's not just any previous government in Syria, but anywhere in the world. I think that Syria is truly a unique situation where some 2/3 of the populations became displaced, became refugee during those years of revolution and war. Take, for example, Germany, where 1 million Syrians, more or less officially, are resident. Take Turkey, where 3.5 million Syrians reside. But I think that we need to think before we expect all of these Syrians to come back, is that Syrians who sought refuge outside of Syria are not the same class of Syrians or type of Syrians. There will be those who unfortunately spent years without proper shelter, without an opportunity to earn a livelihood, whose children are, for the most part, illiterate. You have many other Syrians who became extremely successful, who integrated into the societies which hosted them, many of them, again, in Europe, and who have a difficult time imagining that after all the struggles that they went through to make a new life for themselves, they should just drop everything and go to a country where nothing is sure yet. So I think we have a mixture of these types of Syrians. I'm taking the two extremes. I just came back from Berlin, from the Berlin Foreign Policy Forum, where this issue was brought up. And as you know, it is a conversation that we are all having in Europe. How should we make it viable and tempt people to come back to Syria, not only because Europeans are having their own problems and they need to, reduce the impact of immigration, but also because Syria needs all the qualified and also the labor that it can get. So my perspective on that, Andrew, is that there is a lot of room for discussion, for cooperation between the public sector and the private sector of the host countries and of the new authorities in Syria to create the reconstruction project in various areas of Syria, where instead of pushing the refugees out and instead of giving them small amounts of money, which will not help them rebuild everything they lost, they can work on reconstruction together. And I'll end with saying this: for the first time in decades, I believe we have an international consensus on Syria. all the Arab Gulf countries and Turkey and Jordan and all the European democracies and the United States have agreed that we need to support Syria so that it becomes a stable sovereign state, one that does not cause any more trouble in the area. And Ahmed Shara has been very clear about that. This is what he and his interim current government, which we hope remains interim until there are real elections, this is what they want as well. They want to focus on Syria and not be any more a source of instability in the region like the Assad regime was for 54 years. Since all of these people agree on that, I think that the vision is there, but the mechanics and the logistics to get there still need a little bit of a push. Today, not every Syrian has received the dignity that they want, but it is not unattainable anymore. I believe we can reach it.
That was Reem Alaf. Reem's new book, It Started in Damascus, How the Long Syrian Revolution Reshaped Our World, is available now. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. And finally, on today's show, one of the many challenges confronting President al-Sharaa in particular, and Syria in general, and one of the reasons Syria's war got as bad as it did, is the intense interest taken in Syria by its neighbours. Well, joining me now for a look at how a new Syria might fit, or be allowed to fit, into the broader Middle East strategic picture is Burcu Özçelik, Senior Research Fellow Middle East Security at RUSI. Burcu, let's start with a big question before moving on to a variety of smaller ones. What are the chances that Syria's neighbours just leave it alone?
The chances of that happening in the near to medium term, unfortunately, and I will say unfortunately, are quite low. Syria's security and stability are a matter of imminent concern to neighboring countries, many of whom, Turkey for one, and certainly Israel as well, chiefly recognize and identify Syria's stability as a national security concern for themselves, for their capitals and their peoples. And so Syria has, of course, suffered from a high level of external interventionism over its history, and certainly over the 14-year civil war. And it looks to continue. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all negative, because the extent and scale of the devastation in Syria means that the reconstruction effort, as has been widely reported and is now well known, will be in the billions, extremely expensive, and will require a long time. And Syria cannot do this alone. So international collaboration, foreign direct investment, and other types of incentives are necessary, and these will need to come from neighboring countries, particularly from the Gulf countries.
If it's not Assad and it's not al-Sharaa, is there any imaginable Syrian government that Turkey and Israel in particular would just be happy to let govern Syria, or are Turkey and Israel going to meddle in Syria regardless of who is in charge of it?
Well, that's a great question. It's a moment of great flux and uncertainty. It's only been a year since the fall of the Assad regime. So it is still very early days, and it's a fragile transition period. The external meddling or role of Turkey and Israel has been problematic, certainly from the point of the Syrian people themselves, who are seeking with greater urgency and agency ways to express Syrian sovereignty. And Syria is beginning to show signs that it is readying for a period where it does things its own way. There is a desire at the grassroots level, certainly, for Syria to create a new foundation, a new story of a collective we. But there are many challenges, and external actors, such as Turkey, Israel, pose a challenge to that. The big question that you're pointing to is there an alternative to al-Sharaa? And at the moment, there are contenders on the horizon that pop up sporadically and make a claim that they could govern in a different way or could produce security conditions. But these are very tentative, they're fragile, and they don't have the credentials to govern in the way that Sharaa does, because he is seen as, by many, not all by any means, but he is seen as the leader that was able to sweep down into Damascus from Idlib last year and oust the Assad regime. So he has, whether we like it or not, been able to assert himself as the new leader of a new Syria. There is no plan B for the moment, to borrow from Tom Barak, the U.S. envoy.
But does al-Sharaa have any good options in terms of outreach to, well, Turkey and Israel in particular? I mean, are either of them actually interested in what might be thought of as a normal neighbourly relationship?
So Turkey and Israel's views and visions for Syria differ significantly. Turkey has been very transparent in its preference and strong demand for a highly centralized Syrian state. There might be scope, and this is not an official position, but there might be scope in the future, and pending certain security provisions and guarantees that satisfy Turkey, there might be scope for some form of decentralized administration in parts of the Syrian state from the point of view of Ankara. But this will take time. But they very much prefer a Syria with a centralized system and within its existing borders. They're firm about this. Israel, on the other hand, of course, promotes its own national security interests, is concerned about the border areas in southern Syria, and has taken quite significant, as we know, military action, and continues to do so, to be able to protect its interests and to ensure that there is no entrenchment of a terrorist threat that could pose danger to Israel in the future.
You refer to this campaign Israel embarked upon of smashing up whatever military hardware Syria still had left.
That's right. That's right. Almost since the very beginning of the transition period last December. And as far north as Damascus. So Israel has taken quite extensive steps to dismantle what it says are the remaining pro-Assad or terrorist infrastructure in Syria. But in doing so, it has defanged Syria's ability to defend itself. It has no offensive capabilities. It has very limited offensive capabilities, which makes then other potential partners attractive to Damascus. Turkey is one in terms of providing military training and advice, technical capability building on the professionalization of a Syrian national army. What Israel wants to see in Syria, arguably, is a loosely formed, fragmented state where Israel can assert more influence over various actors and regions of the country. So this is not a centralized, strong state, but a fractured one, which Israel arguably seeks to install in Syria.
Well, we should consider finally a country which is not Syria's direct neighbour, but has certainly played a major role in Syrian affairs up until about a year ago. This is Iran, of course. Syria was a transit point for Iran, sending weapons, supplies, other things to and from Hezbollah. President Assad was largely regarded as at least something of a creature of Iran. Would Iran make any effort, do you think, to re-establish whatever toehold or some toehold in Syria again? Or might they now be looking at this new Syrian setup and just thinking there's no point, there's nothing there we can work with?
Iran faces a number of challenges. And the bigger picture dilemma is what might happen next in its confrontation with Israel. Can we expect another round of kinetic military operations or strikes by Israel against targets inside Iran? And so the Iranian regime is trying to hedge its bets, to shore up its alliances, particularly in the Gulf. But at the same time, because Iran is known to historically play the long game, would, I suspect, want to recover its influence in Syria. But it's a matter of timing. The loss of the Assad regime, the loss of its access, its transit routes and supply chains through Syria and into Lebanon, and the ability to arm Hezbollah and to assert influence inside Syria has been, the loss of this has been hugely significant for the Iranian regime. And there will be efforts, I suspect, to try to recover, to regain access. But it's very difficult to imagine that with the current al-Sharaa-led government in Damascus, there's huge resistance to a re-infiltration of Syrian territory. Iran is down, certainly, but not out. I think it's too soon to presume that Iran will not have any influence in Syria in the years to come. And much of it depends on the pace of stability in Syria itself. If there are security vacuums, if there is a high level of uncertainty, if Damascus is not able to exert sufficient levels of control over its rank and file across its various armed factions in the country, then Iran will seek to find a way to emerge as an influence, a spoiler over such actors, and of course, particularly along the coast with the Alawite community.
Burcu Özçelik, Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security at RUSI, thanks for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.